Hi everyone, my name is Daniel. My interpreter focuses on why interpreters don't correct their own work, or each other's work, I should say. So the author's name is David Byrne, or Darren Byrne. First, when he brings up the Nelson Mandela issues, everybody remembers that interpreter, the fake, caused international outrage. And he, in some ways, applauds that happening. While it was a fiasco, nothing good could really be said of the actual incident. It did bring international attention to the profession of interpreting. And so people understood why it was an outrage, that deaf people deserved access. And so while it was a terrible thing to happen, it was almost a good thing to happen for the interpreting profession. He brings up a question that relates to the rest of the article, and it says, what is the difference between someone who stands there making a series of gestures and a qualified or a certified interpreter whose interpretation deaf people struggle to understand? And so he brings up the unspoken rule, being that we as interpreters don't correct other interpreters because it's wrong. We feel like we're attacking them. I mean, obviously, like we're taught if we're in a team, we should correct each other's work. But if you're not on the team, if you're just an off-duty interpreter watching someone have a terrible interpretation, why don't we interject ourselves into that and fix that interpretation? So we don't want to stop giving access or giving attention to the lack of access that deaf people have, brought up by the Nelson Mandela interpreter. So if our profession doesn't keep the attention on that issue, we're going to start ignoring the real problems, which are qualified, certified interpreters who aren't competent. If we see bad interpretations as interpreters ourselves, we try to withdraw ourselves as far away from the problem as possible and act like it'll just fix itself, or that the moderators maybe of a interpreted presentation or argument or whatever it may be that's being interpreted will stop the interpreting because they understand that it's been improperly done. And interpreters ourselves, instead of blaming the incompetent interpreters, we blame the deaf people because it's not our skills. We're qualified. We have our certification, so we obviously can do it. So it's just the deaf person's preferences don't match our own. So it's not that we're bad. Their preferences don't match ours. And it's not how it should be, because they should understand their own language. It's something we're doing. It's not their understanding of us. And so certification is used to prove qualifications. It's not how qualified the person actually is, how competent they are. It's whether or not they have a piece of paper that says they can do it. And oftentimes, as we've discussed earlier today, having that little piece of paper is better than having a qualified interpreter, because the agency says that they can interpret, so that's good enough for us. And so going back to that question, what's the difference between a fake interpreter and an incompetent interpreter? The question is, or the answer is, we as interpreters who are incompetent actually do more damage than the Nelson Mandela interpreter. Because while they're just sitting up there making gestures, like that obviously was an incident, it was a huge problem, but us, every single day, we're having that impact. And instead of drawing a national attention and having a crisis over it, we ignore it and act like it's not happening. So that happens every single day, but there's no attention brought to it because it's not as important, because it wasn't a giant international event. The author brings up an event that he went to. There were 10 off-duty interpreters present, and the entire time, the voice interpretations were awful. The deaf people were constantly misinterpreted. Questions weren't being conveyed as questions. It was very awkward. And he sat there watching it happen, too afraid to speak up because that's not what you're supposed to do. And so he stayed quiet and saw that they were just constantly getting misinterpreted, until finally there was a question asked, and he felt it was important, and it was completely misinterpreted. And so he finally stood up and said to the hearing people asking or doing the presentation his interpretation of the deaf person's question, because he felt that it wasn't getting across, and they had hit that stumbling block and they weren't getting through it. And he mentioned one time he went to make a comment and he chose to sign it instead of voice it. And halfway through his signing, he realized that it was being completely misinterpreted. So he had to change his entire message to try to self-correct through the interpreter, because they weren't doing the corrections themselves. And the team of the interpreter wasn't helping at all either. And so he says that we as interpreters need to stop removing ourselves from that situation and vocalize when there's a serious breakdown in communication happening. Because if we're not going to do anything about it, no one else is. And so overall, the goal is we as interpreters can be the biggest problem if we're not qualified. And although we may have a certification that says that legally we're qualified, that doesn't mean that we can do every situation or that we are able to meet every event that comes up. We're not going to be amazing at it. And so if we don't have the qualification, we need to back out. If we're not competent, we need to back out. Because all we're doing is hurting our profession and all the deaf people involved, because they're not getting the right message and their message isn't being conveyed properly either. That's all.
I have a question. It's very interesting about, everyday interpreting that isn't clear and is ignored compared with this event that happens in Nelson Mandela funeral. Many interpreters don't want to interject because they're scared that they'll lose their job because of it. There's a lot of fear to just interact or interject the communication. They don't want to. Sometimes my husband is hearing and I won't allow my husband to become an interpreter. I don't want to be married to an interpreter. I want to be married to a man, right? There's one situation I went to work for a big state project, and there was a presentation given. My husband happened to be off that day, and we went and watched together, and there was an interpreter there, and my husband was hearing the difference between the interpreter and what was actually being said and getting very frantic over it. And I looked, and inside I could tell that he was struggling with what was going on. And he's not even in the interpreting world. And he didn't interject it either. He did stand up and said that the interpreter had no idea what I was saying. And the interpreter was taken back by this and started tearing up. But my husband did say that if I would have hired this interpreter, I would have fired her after this job because she wasn't doing her job. And everybody was stunned. He had to clarify that my wife is a smart woman and this interpreter is making her look like she has no idea what she's talking about. That day really woke me up. I asked my husband, you mean some interpreters are clueless of what I'm saying and still interpreting? And he said yes. And I really was careful from there on out and really thanked my husband for interjecting. And I never saw that interpreter again. So you have to be very careful. And that was coming from my husband. How'd you know your husband was getting this? Because of his eyes.
That's part of the thing is we as interpreters feel afraid to interject ourselves into stop a poor interpretation because we don't want to make someone cry or insult someone of our profession.
Right, they feel stuck, right? It's a sticky situation for you guys. You don't want to take advantage of someone too.